Energy is currency. How to stop spending yours for free. Every person alive is issued a currency at birth that no bank tracks, no salary replaces, and almost no one is ever taught to budget. It is not time. Time is merely the ledger it's recorded on. It is energy, the finite daily reserve of attention, patience, warmth, and effort available to spend before the body and mind simply refuse to extend any more of it. The masses treat this currency as though it were infinite, handed out reflexively to whoever asks first, whoever complains loudest, whoever has successfully trained them to believe that refusal is a form of cruelty. By evening, the reserve is gone, spent almost entirely on people, and demands that were never actually worth the price. And what remains for the things that matter most, the work, the ambition, the people who actually deserve it, is whatever happens to be left over, which is usually very little. The strategist inverts this completely. She treats her energy the way a serious investor treats capital: finite, valuable, and never deployed without an accounting of the expected return. This is not coldness. It is the precondition for having anything left to give the people and pursuits that have actually earned it. 10 laws follow, extracted from people who understood, long before behavioral economics gave the principle a name, that energy spent without discretion is a debt eventually paid in exhaustion, resentment, or a life quietly emptied of everything it was meant to build. Everything ahead depends on accepting a single reframe. Energy is not a mood, it is a budget, and a budget spent without discretion runs out regardless of how good the intentions behind each expenditure were. Begin with the law every other law in this record depends on. The first law: stop giving free consultations of your attention. Marie Curie, after winning her first Nobel Prize, became the subject of a public scandal over her personal life. So consuming that newspapers camped outside her home, colleagues at the Academy attempted to have her removed from consideration for further honors, and the general public seemed, for a period, more interested in her private affairs than in the radioactive elements she had already discovered. She did not spend her energy managing this spectacle. She went, during the worst of it, directly back into the laboratory, and shortly afterward became the first person in history to win a second Nobel Prize in an entirely different scientific field. The masses treat every demand for their attention as a bill requiring immediate payment: the friend's crisis, the family member's opinion, the stranger's outrage on the internet, regardless of whether that demand has any real claim on the reserve being spent. The strategist asks a single question before extending attention to anything: does this deserve a withdrawal from an account I cannot refill on command? Curie's answer, in the face of an entire continent's fascination with her private life, was simply no, and the work that resulted from that refusal outlasted every headline written about her by several human lifetimes. Translate this into an ordinary day. Not every text requires an instant reply. Not every family opinion requires a defense. Not every stranger's anger on a screen requires your energy at all. The masses spend their reserve on whoever asks loudest. The strategist spends hers on whoever has actually earned the withdrawal. There is a principle in behavioral research worth naming directly here. Willpower and attentional energy behave, across a day, less like an unlimited utility and more like a muscle that fatigues with use. A phenomenon researchers have called ego depletion. Every small expenditure earlier in the day, a minor irritation absorbed, an argument entered, a favor extended reflexively, draws down the same reserve that, by evening, is meant to be available for the people and work that matter most. The strategist treats the small expenditures with the same scrutiny she'd apply to a large one, because the ledger does not distinguish between a withdrawal made for a good reason and one made simply out of habit. Florence Nightingale, after returning from the Crimean War as one of the most publicly celebrated women in England, withdrew almost entirely from public appearances and social life, working instead from her room for decades, directing sweeping reforms to military and civilian sanitation through correspondence and statistical reports rather than public appearances. She had every opportunity to spend her fame on society's terms. She spent it instead on the reforms that ultimately saved far more lives than her presence at any dinner party ever could have. Guarding attention protects the reserve from casual withdrawal. It does not, on its own, protect against the specific and recurring drain of trying to win arguments that were never actually winnable to begin with. The second law: never pay for an argument that was never winnable. Émilie du Châtelet produced a French translation and commentary on Newton's work so rigorous that it remained the standard reference in France for over a century after her death, all while operating in scientific circles that routinely refused to take her seriously as anything beyond a wealthy woman with an unusual hobby. She did not spend her limited hours defending her right to think. She spent them thinking, finishing the translation in a final push of work so intense that she is reported to have completed the manuscript in the months just before her death, understanding that time was the one resource she genuinely could not budget for indefinitely. This is the second law. Energy spent convincing someone who was never going to be convinced is energy spent at a loss, guaranteed in advance. The masses cannot resist the argument that feels winnable in the moment. The comment section, the family member circling the same old criticism, the colleague who has decided your competence in advance and will not be talked out of the decision, regardless of what evidence you present. The strategist recognizes, usually within the first exchange, whether a disagreement is actually about facts or about a fixed position no fact will move, and she reserves her energy for the former. Consider the ordinary version of this: a relative who raises the same objection at every family gathering regardless of the outcome of the last 10 conversations about it, or an online exchange that promises resolution but has never, in the history of that particular medium, produced one. The tell is simple. Has this specific disagreement with this specific person ever actually resolved through more explanation? If the honest answer across repeated attempts is no, the additional attempt is not persuasion. It is a donation. Caroline Herschel discovered 8 comets and worked for decades as an astronomer at a time when the field offered almost no formal recognition to women, frequently catalogued in her own era's records as merely an assistant to her more famous brother. She spent very little of her energy arguing for the credit that history has, since largely restored to her. She spent it instead at the telescope, and the discoveries accumulated regardless of who her contemporaries initially assumed was making them. Some disagreements are unwinnable one-on-one. Others are winnable but simply not worth what winning them would cost. The third law concerns the discipline of choosing which fights, of the many available, actually deserve the reserve required to fight them. The third law: choose the battles, decline the rest. Wangari Maathai founded a movement that eventually planted tens of millions of trees across Kenya, work that made her a target of a government willing to use force against her repeatedly. She was beaten, arrested, and threatened across decades of activism. And yet across that same span, she was notably disciplined about which fights she entered directly and which she let other allies or other moments handle, understanding that a finite reserve of energy spent on every provocation offered to her would have left nothing for the actual, generational work of reforestation that outlasted any single political battle. The masses feel obligated to respond to every provocation offered, every insult answered, every unfairness argued, every slight avenged in the moment it occurs, as though declining a fight were the same as losing it. The strategist understands that a life is not long enough to win every available argument, and that the ones worth winning are frequently starved of the energy spent on the ones that were never worth entering in the first place. Maathai's forests are still standing. Most of the insults hurled at her along the way are not remembered by anyone, including, very likely, her. Military strategists have long understood a version of this principle under the name of economy of force: the deliberate allocation of minimal resources to secondary objectives so that overwhelming resources remain available for the objective that actually decides the outcome. Applied to an ordinary life, this means asking, before entering any conflict, whether it is the objective that decides the outcome of the larger campaign, or simply a skirmish that feels urgent because it is close by. Declining the wrong battles frees up energy. What you do with what's freed determines whether the discipline was worth practicing at all. The fourth law concerns where that freed energy should actually go. The fourth law: Invest where the return compounds. Beatrix Potter redirected the energy her Victorian society expected her to spend on securing a socially advantageous marriage into writing and illustrating a series of children's books that she then used the proceeds from to purchase farmland across England's Lake District. Land she continued acquiring and managing for the rest of her life, eventually donating thousands of acres to conservation trusts that still protect that landscape today. The energy she declined to spend on the marriage market compounded, decades later, into a body of published work still read by children worldwide and a physical landscape still standing because of what she chose to build instead. The masses spend energy on whatever is expected of them, the social obligation, the appearance that must be maintained, the role that was simply handed down without examination, regardless of whether any of it compounds into something that outlasts the moment of spending it. The strategist asks whether a given expenditure of energy is building something that will still be paying returns in 20 years, or whether it is simply satisfying an expectation that will be forgotten by next season. Potter's books are still in print. The marriages her society expected her to pursue instead are, for the most part, not remembered by history at all. This is simply compound interest applied to a personal life rather than a portfolio. A small, consistent investment of energy into a skill, a piece of property, a body of work, or a relationship that actually reciprocates, accumulates value at a rate that a single large burst of energy spent on a passing social obligation never will. The masses chase the obligation that feels urgent this week. The strategist asks which investments, made this week, are still compounding a decade from now. Investing energy well answers where it should go. It says less about how much can be safely spent before the instrument producing it starts to break down. The fifth law concerns that limit directly. The fifth law. Ration. The performance to protect the instrument. Sarah Bernhardt sustained one of the most demanding theatrical careers in history, touring internationally for decades, and did so by maintaining a level of discipline around her voice and physical recovery that colleagues described as almost severe. Protected rest before major performances, careful management of which engagements she accepted, a refusal to let every opportunity offered dictate her actual schedule. She continued performing, remarkably, even after the amputation of a leg later in her career, precisely because she had spent decades treating her body and voice as instruments requiring maintenance rather than infinite resources to be drawn down without limit. The masses say yes to every opportunity, every social event, every additional obligation stacked onto an already full schedule, treating stamina as though it renewed itself automatically regardless of how it's spent. The strategist treats her energy the way a serious performer treats an instrument, worth protecting specifically so that it survives long enough to keep producing what it was built to produce. Rationing is not the opposite of ambition. It is what makes a long career possible instead of a brilliant short one. The modern equivalent rarely involves a stage or a touring schedule. It looks like declining a fourth commitment in an already full week, protecting sleep against a culture that treats exhaustion as a badge of seriousness, or simply refusing to let every request for your presence be treated as equally urgent. A woman who protects her instrument is frequently accused, by people who have never had to sustain anything for decades, of not doing enough. The accusation rarely survives contact with the length of her actual career. Protecting the instrument matters across a single performance, across a longer undertaking, a career, a project measured in years rather than nights. The same principle requires a different name: pacing. The sixth law: pace yourself for the summit, not the first mile. Junko Tabe became the first woman to reach the summit of Everest, and did so on an expedition that nearly ended before the summit attempt at all. An avalanche buried her camp partway up the mountain, and she was dug out by her Sherpa guide only to continue climbing days later. Accounts of her approach to mountaineering consistently describe a deliberate, unhurried pace, understanding that a climber who exhausts her reserve in the first hours of a long ascent has nothing left for the section of the mountain that actually determines whether the summit is reached at all. The masses treat urgency as a permanent setting, sprinting through every task as though the entire undertaking were a 100-meter dash rather than the multi-day ascent it usually actually is. The strategist pays attention to where she is in the climb before deciding how much energy the current mile deserves. Early enthusiasm, spent too quickly, is simply energy borrowed from the exact moment later on when the actual difficulty of the ascent will demand it back. This is precisely why the earliest excitement of a new job, a new relationship, or a new project is the most dangerous moment to overspend. The enthusiasm feels limitless precisely because none of the actual difficulty has arrived yet. The strategist treats the first mile of any long undertaking with more caution, not less, because she has already learned what the summit tends to demand of whoever is still holding a reserve when they finally reach it. Pacing determines how energy is spent during the climb. The seventh law concerns what happens in the space between climbs, when spending stops entirely, and the only task left is replenishing what was used. The seventh law: treat withdrawal as investment, not as weakness. Mary Kingsley conducted extended solo expeditions through West Africa in the late 19th century, collecting scientific specimens and documenting regions poorly recorded by her contemporaries, and returned from each expedition to a period of deliberate recovery before beginning the next, understanding correctly that an explorer who does not rest between expeditions arrives at the second one with less capacity than the first, regardless of how urgently the next journey seems to call. The masses treat rest as a reward to be earned only after every task is finished, which in practice means it is rarely taken at all, since the tasks never actually stop arriving. The strategist treats deliberate withdrawal, a period of genuine recovery, protected from guilt and from the demands of anyone who believes her energy should already be back in circulation, as an investment with a measurable return, the capacity to perform at full strength on the next expedition, rather than a diminished capacity dragged reluctantly through it. There is a reason elite athletic training now schedules rest with the same rigor once reserved only for exertion. Recovery is not the absence of progress. It is the phase in which the actual adaptation the effort was meant to produce takes place. A woman who treats her own recovery this way is not being indulgent. She is completing the exact process that makes the next round of effort possible at all. Rest replenishes energy that was spent deliberately. Some of the most severe drains on a reserve, though, are not deliberate expenditures at all. They are involuntary ones, produced by grief, disappointment, or rage that arrives uninvited and threatens to burn through the reserve regardless of a budget. The eighth law: convert what drains you into what you build. Anna Komnena, a Byzantine princess who was passed over for the imperial throne she had once been positioned to inherit, spent her remaining decades writing the Alexiad, a lengthy historical account of her father's reign, considered one of the most important surviving sources on the period. A work of considerable scholarly discipline produced by a woman who had every reason, based on how her own ambitions had been foreclosed, to spend those decades instead in bitterness rather than in the disciplined labor of the archive. Grief, resentment, and disappointment are among the most energy-consuming states available to a human mind, and the masses typically let these states simply run their course as unmanaged drains, consuming reserve without ever being converted into anything that outlasts the feeling itself. The strategist does not deny the feeling. She asks instead what it can be converted into. And Komnena's answer, whatever her private resentments actually were, produced a text still read by historians, 9 centuries after the throne she lost stopped mattering to anyone at all. Psychologists studying emotional regulation distinguish between rumination, in which a difficult feeling is replayed repeatedly without producing any new resolution, and productive reappraisal, in which the same feeling is redirected toward a concrete output. Rumination is a pure drain, energy spent with no return at all, simply circling the original injury. Redirection converts the identical emotional intensity into something that exists outside the feeling itself, long after the feeling has faded. Some drains are involuntary, others are entirely voluntary, in the sense that no one is forcing them. They are simply expected, so thoroughly that most people never notice they are choosing to pay them at all. The ninth law: refuse the drain society. expects you to pay willingly. Beryl Markham grew up in colonial Kenya, trained racehorses professionally at a time when almost no woman held that occupation, and eventually became the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic from east to west, a route considerably more difficult than the more famous westward crossing, against prevailing winds the entire distance. She spent very little of her energy on the domestic expectations her society considered a woman's primary obligation, redirecting nearly all of it instead toward aviation and horsemanship, occupations that her era did not consider appropriate expenditures of a woman's time at all. The masses spend enormous reserves of energy maintaining appearances specifically designed by someone else's expectations. The domestic performance, the social calendar, the role assumed rather than chosen. The strategist audits these expected expenditures the same way she audits every other demand on her energy, and where the expectation produces no return, she actually values. She simply declines to keep paying into it, regardless of how long the bill has been considered automatic. Consider the ordinary version, the emotional labor of managing everyone else's feelings in a room, the invisible effort of remembering every relative's preferences, the constant small performance of enthusiasm for occasions that generate no return the strategist actually values. None of these obligations arrived with a receipt attached. Most of them were simply inherited, unexamined, the way a subscription renews automatically until someone finally checks the statement. 9 laws address how to budget energy across a day, a project, a season. The final law asks the same question at the only scale that actually matters in the end, an entire life. The 10th law: budget for an entire life, not just a season. Mary Somerville continued producing significant scientific writing into her 90s, publishing new work later in life than almost any scientist of her era, male or female, having spent decades managing a household, raising children, and navigating a scientific establishment that offered women no formal path into it at all, and doing so by treating her intellectual energy as a resource to be protected and invested across an entire lifetime, rather than burned in a single productive decade and abandoned afterward. This is the final law, because it asks the hardest question of all the laws in this record. Not how to spend energy well today, but how to budget it across 60 or 70 years, so that the reserve is still producing returns in the final decade, rather than exhausted somewhere in the middle of it. The masses spend as though today were the only ledger that mattered. The strategist keeps the books open for a lifetime, and Somerville's final scientific paper, published when she was nearly 90, is the kind of return that budgeting produces. Every law in this record, examined together, reduces to a single practice, treating each day's reserve as a withdrawal from an account that will eventually need to fund a decade you have not reached yet. The masses ask only whether today's spending feels justified today. The strategist asks whether the version of her sitting in that far-off decade would consider today's withdrawal a good use of a currency that, unlike money, cannot ever be re-earned once the years it was meant to fund have already passed. Before the closing, 10 laws, 1 underlying account, and a single discipline running through every one of them. Spend on purpose, or someone else will spend it for you. Closing. The only currency you cannot print more of every other resource discussed in this series, image, voice, silence, position, can, in some form, be rebuilt if spent unwisely. Energy is different. A day poorly spent does not refund itself at midnight. It is simply gone, and the only genuine leverage available is deciding, in advance, where it goes. The masses will always spend first and budget later, if they budget at all. You now have 10 laws that reverse the order, and a currency finally worth protecting the way you would protect any fortune you actually intend to keep.